Hi, welcome to episode 52 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whiddon, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm really delighted to be joined by Tim Steckler, who also lives here in Brooklyn and is an educator, theater artist, and researcher who uses storytelling and theater to promote civic engagement and bridge cultural divides. Tim, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing, and could you share a bit of your story?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's awesome. It's awesome to be on your podcast. I've listened to a bunch of episodes, and I'm honored to be one of these guests on your show.
Yeah, thanks so much for
Um,
coming on.
I'm calling you probably a mile away from where you are, um, away from Cobble Hill, and I live in Park Slope, which is a very similar neighborhood in Brooklyn. But it's beautiful here. I'm watching snow falling outside the second time of the year, which is interesting that hasn't happened. But the yeah, so basically, as you were saying, Michael, I'm a theater artist, I'm an educator, facilitator, and basically, I'm really interested in the intersection between theater and politics and people, and how people interact in their relationships. And it's funny. A lot of people, sometimes my biggest fear when I'm at a dinner party or another kind of gathering is people asking me, "Hey, what is it that you do?" And I'm like, there's so many different angles, and it's hard to explain. But the most succinct way that I can put it is I like working with groups and working with them to tell stories and create theater around issues that are important to them or that serves a purpose for them. And that work has taken me around the world. I have done research and I have led theater workshops with refugees in the Middle East and Jordan and the West Bank, as well as in Europe as well and in the U.S. And most recently, my work has turned much more towards civic issues in the U.S., particularly in New York and also in places in the Midwest as well, about anti-racism, about police and civilian relationships, and other community issues. So, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. Well, I was looking at your bio about LinkedIn, and I saw that you actually had majored in poli sci and you had minored in theater arts. Is that correct?
Yes. So I don't come to this as the most trained theater artist. I come
Yeah.
more from a political science background.
Yeah. No, but I guess I was wondering is like, I guess, do you consider your work in terms of like, say, those two concerns or those two subjects, would you consider more of like a 50-50 balance, or would you think it kind of leans more towards the political science element or more towards the theater element?
That's a good question. I wouldn't delineate it as succinctly of half poli sci, half theater. I think they're so interconnected because both politics and theater, in very different ways, but also very similar ways, are the study of power. In politics, you talk about Congress versus the judiciary versus the presidency, or between, and I come from an international relations background, so the relations between countries and how those happen. But in theater, it's much more about the relation of power between individuals, and it's very connected because when we talk about governments and civic issues, who's driving those issues? It's people. And so what I love about theater is it's kind of a microcosm into how different relationships are formed. And particularly because my work lends itself to talking about politics a lot, that politics are often driven off of power relationships. So whether it's a couple relationship, whether it's dealing with racism, whether it's dealing with police community relations, where there's a huge question of who has power to do what and with what tools at their disposal. And honestly, the study of theater really helps me understand American politics because because Joe Biden is a person just like you or me, and he just has access to the nuclear codes. And so understanding kind of the human mentality behind why people react the way they do with certain power absolutely is an overlay between the two, between
Yeah.
political science and theater.
And then what drew you, I guess, to take those two like skills, and kind of orient it towards kind of, I guess, promoting engagement? Like what because there's lots of different things you still could have done with that. You could have been like a script writer for the next TV show or something, but you instead
Yes.
went into this. So what drew you into this?
Yeah, exactly. I could be writing the next season for the West Wing.
Yeah, West Wing. Yeah,
If there's any I don't know, Hollywood people out there, or Aaron
yeah.
Sorkin out there listening, sign me up.
West Wing on Broadway.
West Wing on Broadway, exactly. That would be amazing. Actually, that could be a really good. That could be a very cool drama. Anyways, yeah. So what got me into this work was so uh, growing up, I was exposed to people from around the world. My dad runs a nonprofit, still does, called Creative Connections, which links together kids in different countries on cultural exchange. They exchange artwork with each other on different topics, and there's also live exchanges that they did. So I grew up with people from all around the world in my life. I'd be on bus rides with Ugandan dancers or Irish dancers and musicians, and that was just a big part of my growing up. And we'd also just travel. I had the privilege to travel a lot growing up, and sometimes visiting folks that my dad knew, and yeah, so interconnection and interpersonal relationships across divides was always something that was a part of my life. And when I was late in high school, I first got interested in political science, where I was doing a research related class on global issues, and I was studying the divide between Sunnis and Shiites, which are two different sects of Islam in the Middle East, where a lot of the times in places like Iraq and Syria, also somewhat in Afghanistan and in some other parts of the Muslim world. Sometimes in recent years, fighting has become between those two sects, and that's been a very recent thing. Although those divides have lasted for thousands of years, and studying these issues, I realized basically the news talked about these issues as these big intractable religious conflicts and what could happen. And the more that I studied this and the more that I read, I realized actually the divide between these two different types of Islam has very little to do with religion itself. It had everything to do with politics, where often the divides would come because a colonial power would empower one group over another in a certain region, or there would be a resource depletion, and people would naturally kind of divide into two different camps to fight over what the resources that were available, like water or food, in places like eastern Syria. And yeah, that just intrigued me, that like if the divides between people are not from something so intractable, it's really about the relations between people, politics, and power. That's something that's a little bit more malleable. That's clay that you can work with. And so I was intrigued by that. And then when I was in college a few years later, I was walking down kind of the main concourse, the main hallway in my college, Principia College, and there was a poster for a class called Theater for Social Change. And I was like, theater for social change? That's a thing? I thought basically actors just sing Fiddler on the Roof on stage and then get a bow and then that's it. But saying like, wow, you can actually enact real change through theater. What is this? And it was funny. I kind of knew as I was signing up that this was going to be a class that was going to be very important to me. I don't have many of those moments, but that was one where I was like, this is a class that's going to affect my life. And it was taught by this amazing woman named Caroline Watson, who is originally from Hong Kong, a white woman from Hong Kong. And she helped start a nonprofit called Huadan. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. With using theater with migrant women, migrant workers in China that were women, about their issues and their plights working in factories and other areas. And um, we ended up doing some work. And Principia College is in the Midwest in Illinois, and this was back in 2015. So right before the 2016 election, and very much in the Rust Belt area. And we were in Alton, Illinois, and it was an area that's kind of forgotten. It's an area that actually in recent years it's been more up and coming, but when I was there, definitely kind of like old industry, it's just a place that just felt on the sidelines. And we worked in a school where we worked with kids that were very much on the sidelines. So people that were that had abuse issues at home, that were dealing with drug issues. Some kids one kid in particular that was homeless. A few kids that were trans, and it was interesting that these people came together when they found out about this workshop, and we just ended up starting with a lot of theater games and just having fun and creating kind of unlikely divides. And then we started to, and this woman, Caroline Watson, taught us about ways to involve the audience in our performances. So basically, there would be an example of maybe a sister trying to prevent a brother from doing drugs, and the struggle with that, where the brothers resisting, or issues where a kid has to come out as gay to a very conservative Christian parent, and how do you navigate that? And with these issues that we presented on stage, we would then invite the audience to come onto stage and saying, these are the issues. What's an alternative to this issue that you see here? And it was incredible, where actually the school that we wanted to perform this in ended up banning our performance. They said, because you're talking about queer issues, it's going to be too controversial. So we ended up putting it on in a community based place, in a community center. And it was incredible, where you had these like old Midwesterners stepping in on saying, how does a queer kid come out to their parent, and or how do we deal with drug issues or abuse issues in our society, and it just made me fall in love, and say, like, wow, there's real intersections between the issues that we deal with, and an entryway through storytelling that allows us to really be able to hear opinions or experiences that we wouldn't otherwise. I can go on with that, but that
No.
was basically how I got into it. Yeah.
Well, you got me thinking, because there was with the Academy Awards just happened,
Yes.
and when Michelle Yeoh wins her Academy Award, and she addresses the audience, and addresses like older women, and addresses like Asian people, it's very inspiring, and there's a lot of power that gets communicated to the audience when they see that like role model. And for me, I think one of the things that I realize, and I guess you kind of like, I guess you're sympathetic to like, I guess, to those role models emerging. But what I realized in a very real sense is that, like, for me, as like an able-bodied white heterosexual man, there's really nothing out there that if I wanted to do something, somebody who looks like me has had that position, right? Whether
Mm.
it's a CEO, whether it's a hedge fund, manager, whether it's a doctor, a lawyer, and women have certainly done those, but there's still lots of roles and lots of positions, like president of the United States. Like, somebody has had that role, and the more you are skew away from that, like I guess, identity, the harder it is to do it. I mean, it's hard enough as a white man to do things. Imagine how much harder it is when you don't look like that, when there's not even that kind of ostensible similarity with somebody that has that
Yeah.
position. So that much that I understand. But the one thing I feel like that has been missing in in Hollywood is you were talking about that forgotten area around Illinois, and I feel like the what you don't see, what I haven't seen in Hollywood, in in as long as I've been like an adult, has been really a focus on those forgotten towns to make people aware of those people who have been forgotten as well. Like there's a lot of things that we should be focusing on, but I think it's kind of not paid attention to everything. Do you find that's the case as well? I mean, after since you kind of lived in that area for a little bit.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And it's yeah. First of all, responding to what you were saying about the Oscars the other night, yeah, I'm so happy that Everything Everywhere All at Once got so many awards. And if you haven't seen that movie, see it. It's hilarious. It's amazing. It's so creative. And yeah, both Michelle Yeoh and I forgot what the man who won the best supporting actor's name is, but he gave an amazing speech too, where he's also Asian, and just talking about how, I mean, his parents came he came as a refugee from Vietnam, and how and how special this moment was, and he held his Oscar and said, "Hey, Mom, look at this! I did it!" Um, which and he said, like, this is the American dream, and it's just, yeah, it's wonderful seeing, seeing that representation and that celebration, which is long overdue at the Oscars, and yeah, with the forgotten areas that you're talking about, it's really interesting because, I mean, that area in Illinois, I literally just visited a friend out there the other day, and I might be doing some work back at my former college in the future, and it is really interesting where it's definitely, in Hollywood terms, the less sexy part of of the country. And it's funny just being in New York too, just hearing how much stuff takes place here. And even though oh sorry um even though so, like, most films are filmed in California and Hollywood, my sister was just telling me how many sets are designed to look exactly like New York,
Oh yeah.
just these big studios that replicate New York streets. And yeah, and it's interesting where, not just in Illinois, I've been this past year more and more connected to communities in Eastern Kentucky, particularly in Letcher County and Martin County. And it's deep in coal country, deep in the hills and hollers of Appalachia. And it's also another forgotten area. And it's interesting where I can't tell you the exact reason why. Maybe it's because it's away from an urban area, or maybe it's just old kind of divides about what stories do we want to be listening to. We are talking about race representation, but it's also an interesting idea about geographic representation too in this country. That's just another layer. And last year I did with the organization Creative Connections. I helped run a workshop between students in Kentucky and Western Massachusetts, two
Oh
very
wow.
rural areas. The folks from Kentucky were all white. The folks from Massachusetts were mainly folks of color who were teenage moms or pregnant teenagers. And it was a very interesting dynamic where you could tell that these two communities had no idea about these two communities. They weren't represented on TV anywhere. They weren't represented in movies. But we did an exercise, and this was all online, where we shared cultural artifacts, which is where I often do this with students. I'm going to lead a workshop later today with a group from Mongolia, where they're going to where they share an artifact, an object, a physical object that's important to them, whether it's a family Bible, or a picture of food from Puerto Rico that their family enjoys, or a shirt from a family reunion, or an instrument. And it was really interesting during the sharing that one of the students from Kentucky brought out this bluegrass guitar, and he must have been like 15, 16, something like that, and he just started strumming, and it was amazing. Like, I would have paid to hear that. There's this guy in the middle of nowhere just jamming out this amazing bluegrass stuff, and these folks in Massachusetts were like, that's amazing, and that reminds me of like Spanish music from like the DR or from Puerto Rico, and just these very unlikely connections. And so it's interesting where we view these areas, these, whether it's Rust Belt, whether, I mean, from the Northeast. I think, speaking for myself, I was raised with a lot of negative stereotypes about the South. That we often don't focus on these quote unquote other areas, or quote unquote other people from what's shown in the mainstream in Hollywood, or on TV, and there's so much opportunity when you're able to get past that.
Yeah, it's and there's so many. I think there's endless stories to tell, and I guess, to me, I think what was most satisfying for me about the Everything Everywhere All at Once was that it was it was such a complicated story, but it also wasn't a story that like hinged on necessarily like the couple being like Asian. It was just more like they were kind of put into those circumstances. And I think what was like beautiful, it was just kind of it was it was just really good to see that kind of like that kind of unique performance that was kind of given, I think, to like just the best people to have that role. And it
Hmm.
was I think that was really I don't know, it was very eye opening. And I think it was also like, I think sometimes, like a lot of times you see, I think like if you were to, I was thinking about like the TV shows that do focus on like the, not the classic like New York City, LA setting. Like there's, and I don't watch these shows, but I know like there's Yellowstone and other things. And I guess to me, like even if you were to like turn the lens into other areas, right, that there's got to be that balance of kind of like respect and compassion, because there's like there's ways of kind of like looking at other areas. I mean, and you could do this looking outward too, but like looking inward to where you just kind of like make something seem very pitiful, or you make something seem overly like glamorous. And I think things are complicated, and I hope that the entertainment world would start to kind of look at like within the country with like with a curious eye, and a respectful eye and a compassionate eye, because the country, we have like 330 million people here, and like we're as big as like
Hmm.
Europe. And I think it's easy to just think, oh, American, and like they should just be like us, but there's so many unique areas and so many unique like kind of challenges and communities that I think that it would do us all good to have. I don't know if I'd say it's more responsible, like kind of like filmmaking or entertainment, but just kind of maybe more open-minded, curious, like I don't know, script writing, or I don't know, storytelling. I don't know.
Yeah, and that it's an interesting question about why that, asking the critical question about like why isn't that representation there, whether it's different regions in the big cities, or people that aren't white, that are shown in the media. um and and it's really interesting that like, there's a few authors. One particular author I love is, and a theater practitioner, is a man by the name of Augusto Boal. And Augusto Boal did a lot of his theater work in Brazil. He's from Brazil, and he did a lot of theater to resist the Brazilian dictatorship that existed during the 70s and 80s. And he was arrested, he was exiled, a lot of different things. But something that he talked about was in the theater world, but I think this also extends to the film world as well, is that um, it often stories serve, uh, like upper class and upper class white people, and even back to Shakespeare's day, where he was commissioned by kings to write a lot of his stuff. And you look at Hamlet, and it's the story of this prince that's bringing down this his uncle Claudius, and who killed his father, and Hamlet seeking justice. But everybody dies in the end. It's a tragedy. But what happens in the end is that the king of Denmark then then rides in, and the another king kind of saves the day, and that's it. And as opposed to entirely rethinking, hey, maybe there's a different system that could be there. Sorry about the
Mhm.
siren.
No, I think there's a
Um,
very New York element to our New York discussion here. Thank you.
yes,
Thank you.
I live on the intersection between a fire station and a hospital, so or very close to one. So it's interesting. Anyways, and yeah, but saying that, like, what happens if we tell stories that about working class people, about people that don't normally get the spotlight. And I think, for I think a lot of and this is just my opinion, for a lot of producers and others, that would be a big step where it's saying they're going to talk about things that might be uncomfortable. And I mean, talking about the Kentucky example, it's an area in the world where they're digging coal for a lot of the country and empowering a lot of coal plants. And at the same time, that's slowly being phased out. That area was essential for American industry and how it was built. Um, and now it's and there's a lot of poverty there now. And when I talk to folks there, the opioid crisis really hit hard in the region that I was working with communities that I was working with, um, and a lot of other issues. And we don't want to ask the hard questions of saying, this place that we rely on, and as we talk about needed changes from climate change and others, that people are going to be suffering, and we have to address these issues. That we can't just shove these guys to the side, and that if we tell those stories, there might be some discomfort, there might be some hardship. And I think it's the same thing with stories about race that might make us uncomfortable. It kind of sheds some hard truth, and and it may make us look inward and say, like, wow, how am I benefiting off of some of these um, about benefiting off of some of these people, and these systems where I'm doing okay and these others aren't. And not necessarily staying in that guilt and feeling bad about yourself, but just recognizing that's part of the fabric of the United States. It's part of the fabric of this country, of the world. And
Yeah.
what happens then?
Yeah, and I think, part of, I think, if you're going to be, I think, brutally honest, is you're going to confront like some uncomfortable truths. But I think that the reality is we've always been like living with that. And like for me, with what I've been trying to do, I already mentioned like the principles that I keep kind of returning to are that idea of like kind of respect and compassion, curiosity, humility. But like it's not just about like using those to people who might disagree with you politically or on social issues. It's just in your everyday life. Like to me, do you think about the woman who's giving you that manicure, that mani pedi, right? Like what's her life like? There's challenges all over. The people that work on the restaurants, or that guy who rides this bike through the traffic and all kinds of weather to deliver you your food for the $3 tip. Like there's a lot of heart. It's not even like just like a white thing. It's more about just realizing how many different stories there are, and we need to kind of expand our focus towards, I think, all those people. Like we went through the pandemic talking about essential workers, but as soon as we could, we've forgotten about them. When we go back, we're off
Mm,
to the races. And I think it's that element of it's not even just fixating on like the Rust Belt, but there's so much within the country, especially in the Rust Belt, where people are struggling to get by. And that could really, I mean, there are refugees. Like I didn't know there were a lot of refugees like in Idaho, people who've like been
I didn't know
uprooted
that.
from like Afghanistan. And I think there are other states like that too that are kind of like some of the preferred spots for people to resettle. So there's just so much out there. And I mean, in here in our country to explore. But you're doing it, but you're using theater in a different way, more like participatory. And I know you talked about the students, but obviously, I had the chance to see your work with the Irondale, right?
Hmm.
So like, how did you get involved with that? And could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So I'm so glad you were able to see that performance. So
Same here.
this is more recent work that I'm doing. Cut. 8 years into the future from that last story I told in Illinois. So basically, Irondale is a really cool theater space in Brooklyn, and you actually go in, and it's in an old church, and the managing the managing director of the place is Jewish, so it's just funny that just an interesting juxtaposition, and and so it's a old church that's turned into a theater space, and basically Irondale has been around for 40 years now, and they do a lot of political style theater, and they have a lot of great shows. If you're in the New York area, I totally recommend checking them out. Um, and I am involved with and I'm a facilitator with their program to protect, serve, and understand. And it's a program that's meant to bring together cops and civilians around dialogue, improv, and storytelling. This program was founded by Terry Grease um, after seeing the video of the killing of Eric Garner. And he was selling fake cigarettes or illegal cigarettes on the side of the street while police officers came and threw him to the ground, and he was the first person to say famously, "I can't breathe," and then he died. And basically, the whole idea behind the program was asking, okay, there were so many different things that went on there, so many different opportunities for a different kind of interaction that didn't occur, both with the person selling cigarettes and with the police officer, particularly where he saw this big black man and thought he was a threat for whatever reason, and ended up getting into an altercation where he ended up killing somebody, he ended up murdering somebody, and just saying, how do we unpack the various stories that was in each of their minds, each of those various decisions, and how do we tweak those a little bit to tell a different story? What's the potential, and can that and critically, can those decision making skills be informed by having a closer relationship between the police and the people they're policing? And so that thus this program is born. It was 7 cops and 7 civilians that come together, and it's now been going on for 10 rounds, which is awesome. And basically, we start each program. It's a 9 to 10 week workshop, and it culminates in a public sharing, a public performance, where we begin each workshop and the show itself with a meal, a home cooked meal, whether it's chili, whether it's like curry, just any hot meal that a volunteer brings. And we just start out by talking about issues that are relevant to the city and relevant to each other's work, and then we play. We go into improv games, and it's very interesting where uh, basically having kind of these cops, some of whom are armed with guns, just like doing different theater games and singing rounds, and getting people to get relationships with each other. And we interject a lot of dialogue into the work. We involve a style of theater called documentary theater, which was particularly developed um, in a few decades ago, where basically people interview folks that are different from them. So a police officer might interview a civilian, and a civilian might interview a cop. And we had one cop from the Hispanic from the Bronx interviewing the whitest woman that you could think of, and it was very funny seeing how she kind of talked about that, and embodied her on stage, and yeah, also civilians interviewing cops. And the whole point is just saying, like, how do we walk in each other's shoes? How do we have a different understanding? So when there's another altercation, what happened back in 2015. Um, how can we tell a different story? And it's incredible what changes happened, where we have people that are very conservative, people who are very, very liberal, people of all races. It's an honor being in the room where I'm like, wow, there are so many different types of people. And the beauty of it is that we're talking about issues related to policing that affects everybody. It's like a dream come true for me, where it's like talking about the real issues that affect America, and we're talking about people from so many different backgrounds. And back to what we were talking about, where we talk about how stories usually represent a particular race, particular gender, particular region. This was the absolute opposite, where it was really sitting in everybody's stories. And that's one of the really cool things that I love about this work, is that when we open up the space or enlarge the table to include more stories, there's so many different ideas that can be shared. And there was one woman who was very much like considered herself an abolitionist in the program, and the talk back, she was talking about, I still don't love the idea of the police, but like for police officers, I care about you. I care about your mental health. That's not something that I cared about before. I wanted
Yeah.
to see them gone. It's funny, like, because there's all these slogans, and that kind of I mean, I
Yeah.
have my questions around police, but feel like they can, like, whether it's like all cops are bad cops, or defund the police, that I think I understand their political utility, but it's saying, like, who are the people that you're talking about? And once you get to that question, it's not just a question of political belief. If you talk about the people wearing the uniform, if you talk about the people that they're serving, then you enter in a whole other discussion, and a whole other kind of wide range of what you can do when you focus on the relationships and improving
Yeah.
those.
Well, it's funny. Like I feel like what I would picture from either side, right, is that somebody might say, "Well, all I'm going to do is look at this one incident, and I don't want to look past that because then I'm being sympathetic. Like I don't want to be sympathetic, right?" And you could be somebody who's looking at the police and be like, "I don't care. They did something wrong. Screw them." Or it could be the other side saying, "Well, they did something wrong. They provoked the cop." And I think to me, we need to kind of get past this idea of like, well, I don't want to know that, to be like, we want to fix the problem, we want to look back, like if you and I don't know the whole story, but isn't it worth really trying to understand the actual experience of the people leading up to that moment and their backgrounds to understand what all the different triggers were? Because if you we have to, I think everything goes with the assumption that people are bad people, right? If the person provoked a cop and gets killed, they deserved it. They're a troublemaker. And if the cop did it, then the cops are a murderer. He was out to just, he's trigger happy. And neither of those are, I think, going to be true most of the time. They might be, but we should be looking into the story with more of an open mind to say, like, what made this happen, and not why did this bloodthirsty cop do this, or why did this irresponsible citizen do that. We're starting with too many preconceived notions and then just trying to find facts to build to support the story versus looking at it. I mean, would you say that's kind of one of the things that kind of happens with any kind of controversial issue that seems to pop up these days?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, where I often, I mean, your whole point about being curious
Mhm.
behind these divides, is, I think, is essential. And I like, one thing I love about this theater work is it really makes you question why people do what they do, or why people want what they want. And I once had a dance teacher, a wonderful woman by the name of Karen Montanaro, who, basically, uh, like, when we were talking about intent in our dance work and where to go, saying, like, when we want something, we don't often want that thing. So, like, if I want to, like, for instance, if I want to buy a Ferrari, let's say my paycheck uh, quintupled, and I was saying,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna, yeah, you never know. You see me riding around a Ferrari, know that I made it.
Yeah.
But saying, when people, when somebody wants a Ferrari, they don't want the big hunk of metal that can drive somewhere. They want the power of that. They want the the status that comes with a Ferrari. They want that feeling of shifting the gears and feeling the engine. They maybe love the mechanics, the intricate work of it, and that speaks to something about them. Likewise, when somebody wants to buy a house, it's very like it's a source of stability. It's a source of saying this is a platform to build to have a family or a partner with, and it's very little, few times about the thing itself. There's an underlying, I'd say, spiritual component below what that object is. And I think likewise, going back to the idea of police and civilian actions, that when a cop acts, with undue force, I mean, understandably, that should be condemned. But asking why is that, or what's that person seeing? What's that person afraid of? However, that's skewed by kind of racism or a culture that allows for more violence. Who knows? But asking that underlying question of what does that person want? What is that person seeing, and where does it come from? That's the much more interesting question for me than what exactly just happens. And likewise for civilians, that it's interesting that I work with this wonderful guy at Irondale. His name is Michael David Gordon, and he often, I mean, he's a black man, and he was the musical director for this show, and he talks about saying the civilians also need to have a picture about the cops too that are different, and saying that like, hey, like saying like where having more compassion about where they're coming from. Maybe that'll impact their relation of how they treat that cop in a difficult altercation. That might actually save their butts. And it's not a fair thing, but there's more potential for that interaction of asking, what is it that we both want? And can there be any alignment? And when you have a closer relationship, there's that potential. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and it's again, there's to me there's almost like this spark of, I mean, of hope, or I guess optimism, when you talk about that striving to kind of understand. Did you were there any like epiphanies that you saw like on one side or the other, where like either the police or the civilian was just like, I never thought of it that way. I mean, from the performance that I got to see, it definitely sounded like there were civilians talking about they didn't realize what the police were going through, and the police were kind of the same thing. But you obviously observed it for a much longer amount of time, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that idea that I was talking about earlier about care, where it's saying I may hate the idea of the policing itself, but I care about you as individuals. There was also a really interesting moment. I think this was also in the show that you saw, where there was this one police officer who was talking about who just kind of went on this rant at the end about how much she hates the word training, and saying like the solution for cops and civilians is cops is we need more training. We're not needing more training. We need more tech training. And she just shouted like, I'm not like a dog. I don't need more training. And I found that really interesting. That was, I mean, even for me personally, something that made me think differently, where in this type of theater work, and when we talk about like how do we transform structures around us, I really try to avoid the word solutions. How do we find the solution to racism? How do we find the solution to classism in the country? How do we find the solution to police and civilian issues? I find that people aren't math problems. There's very few solutions that are going to solve everything. What there are alternatives, and there are different decisions that we can make. And when we play with alternatives, maybe that'll leave us in a place that leaves us more fulfilled, more closer as a country. So that was just a time where my mind was changed, and I think it was a really cool moment of growth for this woman, Frankie, who talked about that, where just saying about her humanity as a police officer too needed to be changed, or needed to be more seen in that instance.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a I never thought of it from that angle because that's really powerful. Is sometimes, sometimes people just want to be heard, and I don't think that it should be. I wouldn't dismiss it as okay. She got to say her thing. Let's move on. But I think if you really kind of take the words at face value, like to me, what I got from that when I was because I was that was at the performance I was at was more almost like from an outsider's viewpoint, it's just well they need to be trained how to deal with this situation, and we need to program this, and if this happens, then this. But these things happen in real time, and like there's the solution isn't just training because we aren't computers that just can go from this to this to this, and you've got to dig a lot deeper to solve the problems, and she didn't bring that up, but I think maybe that's more. I think healthy dialogue is like listening to what the person says and say, okay, so why is she saying that, and how do we dig deeper to address the feelings that are making her say that? Because we understand you don't need more training. That doesn't necessarily mean she's saying she doesn't want to be part of the solution. It's just we've got to look at other things. So I mean I think it sounds really sounds like you really did some very important work, and like as I was watching, I was like, this is the kind of thing that like Netflix needs to put out there. But I don't know if that's even the case because I don't know what happens once you put it on like a big screen or you get it out there for the millions, if it changes the authenticity of the interactions.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because I'm so happy we're talking about this and you were able to watch the show. What was there anything that you found surprising or kind of like changed your perspective?
But I think I came to the show already kind of wanting to think about things in a different way, and I think it might have more kind of like reaffirmed it a little bit to see that there's valid fears on one side, valid fears on the other. There's valid exasperation on one side, there's valid exasperation on the other side. So I mean, to me, what the message that I took was more just like, just stepping into the other person's shoes and listening is so empowering to, I guess, to getting to a not a solution, but to, I mean, I guess maybe like a resolution, like kind of feeling like
Hmm.
we're all pulling in the same direction. Like we need, like to me, like that there's always going to be a mistake. We're not perfect, right? Like if the perfection is basically static, like if you don't want any mistakes to happen, then just don't do anything, right? So we're human beings, we do things, we're going to make mistakes. But I think what you want is buy-in from both sides to say, like, we can do this better and we're going to pull in the same direction. And if something bad happens, we have to be committed to working together to find a solution, not finger point. And I think that was the most beautiful thing I saw with what you guys are doing. It was less about policing and more almost like a blueprint for any issue out there.
Yeah, because again, these underlying dynamics of power and relationships I love that idea of resolution that you're talking about. This idea of saying like not necessarily solution, but there can be this piece when there is a relationship where we can say we don't agree on everything. There might be stuff we or even in conflict about, but there is a certain piece of being able to name it, sit in that tension, and do something about that. And yeah, and that yeah it's interesting that you talk about these themes going beyond policing. I think in this country right now, I find it so heartbreaking how I saw a news article in the New York Times, the column that was talking about how like what would happen if the country divided between red and blue areas. What would happen if that happened? If they literally created two different countries, that you had the coasts and basically the interior of the country, um, where one area is liberal and one area is conservative. And how would that work out economically? I'm like, we're getting to this point in these conversations. Are you kidding me? And saying like there is so much more potential for us to be curious about people of different political beliefs. Um, and and in these lessons about police and civilians, and I mean we were all there in 2020 when those conversations were really really tough and there was a lot of tension in that summer. And there is the potential for something else. It's just I'm not going to say it's easy. I think it's very hard. You have to be intentional about curating those relationships and spaces, but it is possible.
Well, I've been reading this book by a guy who actually had the privilege of having a Zoom with. I'm looking at it now just to make sure I get his name right. But the name of it it's called American Schism, and it's by Seth David Radwell. And one of the interesting insights that he talks about is how like the transformations that have happened in our country were never top down, right? And when we talk about that, it sounds like we're talking about like a dictator, right? But it doesn't have to be like a
Mm,
dictator right wing. It could be left wing too. He said like the things, the transformations that happened that took traction and lasted were things where it was from the bottom up, right? Because when it's from the
mm,
bottom up, you get the politicians will line up with what the people want. And I think what I've been doing for myself is like, you know what? I'm not going to follow the beat of the drum that tells me I'm supposed to just take this side or take that side, because that none of the issues that we've ever confronted are ever that simple, right? So I want to be part of that grassroots movement to kind of show the politicians that what the people really want is not, I'm on a podcast, like I say, not the bullshit that's peddled to us about how we're supposed to not like each other, but show the responsible dialogue can happen. And I've, really not done very much yet with this, but I'm trying. And you've already done a lot of powerful things. But I think it's, people like you, people like Bravery Angels, which we're a part of, people like
mm.
Starts With Us and Bridge USA, and so many other organizations and even thinkers out there that I think are this groundswell of grassroots people saying enough. And we're kind of, I think the more that this message gets out there, the more it'll give license, or it'll be cue the politicians to say, wait a second, they don't want this. And it might take a while. It could take years. Martin Luther King Jr., Brown versus Brown v. Board of Education, all those things, that those weren't like the final steps. Those were the beginning to something, right? I mean, Barack Obama doesn't get elected in 1956. It takes from 1954 till 2008 for us to have a black president. But it happens, and it's got to start somewhere. And I think that's on all of us to just kind of keep trying to be more, not necessarily moderate, but more balanced, more thoughtful, more mindful about our opinions and our thoughts.
Yeah,
Sorry, didn't mean to talk so much.
no, 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 no. Talk away. I feel like
That's
we're
you
speaking
make
a
me think.
similar language. Um, where I mean, speaking of the Oscars,
Mm-hmm.
there's I recommend seeing the movie that won the best animated short. It's called the boy. I think it's called the boy, the fox, the horse, and one other animal. The mole, the boy, the mole, the fox, and the horse. It's beautiful. If you're ever in a sad mood and you want something, you know, that'll like that's like a kid's book put on an animation that'll cheer you up. That's definitely cheesy, but it's good. I totally recommend that. And the story basically follows this boy that that is lost in the middle of the woods, and slowly he befriends these animals that become his companions, and they also just dish out such valuable life advice. And this boy's just trying to find his way home, and one of the animals is just saying, is talking with him. The boy's just asked, like, I don't know which way to start. I don't know which way to begin my journey. I don't even know which step to take. And the mole thinks for a second. He's like, why don't you follow the river? Why don't you just go to the river and follow that home, and it'll eventually lead you somewhere. And there was something when I saw that in theaters, and I was I definitely cried too easily, or not too easily. Screw that. I cry a lot. And I started crying. I started crying in that moment because there was something so beautiful about that idea of like follow the river. And I think there's connections with that with different populist movements that happen on the ground, the grassroots ideas that saying like when there's a need in society, when there's that groundswell, not blindly, but when you're able to follow that river of people talking with each other and saying, "Hey, this is an issue that we want to talk about in our society. We're different from one another, but there is interest when we find that we're not just that like when we get beyond that we are divided, but that we've actively been divided, and saying whether it's union movements, whether it's issues about race, whether it's issues about class, the forgotten regions that we're talking about, the police community relations, refugees, whoever. Once you get that groundswell of a relationship, it builds on one another, and that's a way of finding that river home,
Yeah.
in many ways.
Yeah, I want to go on record to say I don't. To me, the way I think about this is it's more perceived polarization than actual polarization, and I think to me the
Mm.
difference is, we are fed images that are easy for media to kind of feed us, and for politicians to feed us for clicks, votes, donations, your views, whatever it is. But like when you actually go out there and you meet people, I don't see what I'm told I'm supposed to be prepared to like to be upset about. Like I don't see it. Um and I'm sure it's out there. I know it's out there, but there's so much more decency, I think, than we're led to believe from everyday people. And I think that it's more, I think I call it, we've been rubbernecked into polarization. And I think like if you think about like when you go to school, right? When you're in school, nobody pays attention to the kids that are working together well. Everybody will rush though to the fight that happens after school, right?
It's really funny, yeah.
Right. So so like, and the way a school media company would run is they would show that fight, and then they would interview all the friends of the people that were in each side, and they would turn it into like the polarization between the soccer players and the football players, or between the kids from this part of town and that part of town, and they would never even talk about all the good things that were happening, right? And I think that with the media nowadays, especially, you can there's so many stories out there amongst 330 million people that you can find something that's going to grab eyeballs. And as much as there might be earnest journalism that's happening, the companies, the people who are actually deciding what's going to be out there and what's going to be emphasized, are choosing the things that are going to grab eyeballs, the things that people want to talk about. And of course, people always want to talk about the controversy. They always want to express outrage, because that's what gets us. Maybe it's what gets us fired up. Maybe that's what gets us, gets the adrenaline going after like another humdrum, mind-numbing day at the office or working somewhere. I don't know, but I just don't buy the idea that we are actually polarized. I think that we perceive the polarization, and we all just need to kind of see past that.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking about this, I was thinking about any like yeah, media talks about these like this definitely negative news bias, and they do it for clicks. And I was just asking myself, is there an alternative? Um, and not just this is their solution, but are there alternatives? And I think back to theater, where definitely conflict drives interesting stories. I get that. Um, that like you don't have an interesting story if everything goes perfectly well for somebody.
Right. Right.
Everybody would leave the theater and fall asleep, which I've done sometimes. But the the but there's so many other stories other than quote unquote like armed conflict or confrontations that there.
Right.
I mean, there's a such thing as rom-coms. There's a such thing as beautiful like love stories that are on
Yeah.
screen. There's stories where people are working together to solve
Yeah.
a certain issue, where it's the conflict is in whether it's two kids that are like saying, can we secretly get candy from the candy store, or uh, the idea of like two people trying to construct a home, two people or a group of people that are planning for some type of social change, like in a Billy Elliot or a show like that, or a Les Miserables, and there's there's so many other types of stories that we can tell that are intriguing, other than the idea of like we're in this falling apart country, and there's all this stuff, and yeah, I guess fear can be a grabber, and you also have that in advertisements as well, where they really play on people's fears. But there's so much potential for another type of story that I think will be just as as intriguing. And I don't know. I'm not a journalist. I don't know why those stories aren't being told, but again, if there's enough demand and there's like and from consumers of saying like we want something other than something that makes us ridicule a whole group of people,
Yeah.
uh, that would be amazing.
Yeah. Two things that I shudder to bring these up, but I feel like I have to. So even if we go over a little bit,
Yeah, no
um,
problem.
but one is that I grew up loving comic books, but what I'd say is what I don't like about the Marvel movies is that's basically raised almost a whole generation of people who think that there's always going to be this kind of like like violent conflict to resolve problems, and that everything is existential, right? Like if you watch all these movies now are all about like it's an existential crisis. This is going to be solved only with violence, and we need to leave it to the superheroes. Like I have nothing to do with like so if you watch it, it's like the whole universe is at stake or whatever, but nobody can do anything other than these 5, 6, 7 superheroes. And I think that's one of the problems with our society is everybody's just like, well, Joe Biden's going to fix it or Donald Trump's going to fix it. No, each of us is going to fix it. That's the one of the problems I think with like that kind of hero obsession is that all of us are supposed to be the heroes. It's not the superheroes. It's all of us that's going to fix the problems. And then the other thing, just thinking about like Hollywood, was a friend of mine, Ian Reifwitz, had recommended this movie called Vengeance, which had oh my god, I forget the guy's the actor, but it had Ashton Kutcher in it, and it's about like this New York podcaster who goes down to Texas to for a girl's funeral, and it turns out that she died of like a drug overdose, and it's just kind of that conflict of like the city and like the South, but like not in a way where it like kind of caricatures one or the other. At least that's not the way I took at it, but more kind of like I mean, maybe a little bit kind of like saying the city like solutions aren't always going to be the case, but it was just a very provocative story, and talking about like kind of violence or like conflict is to me the resolution was disturbing, but it was provocative, and it really made my wife and I think about it for days actually.
I would love to see that movie. It
You
sounds
should
really
totally see
interesting.
it. You should totally see
Yeah.
it. So, so I guess we definitely we've kind of probably hit the limit here for talking. Although I'd love to do a multi-part
Yeah,
series
it's a
talking
great
about these things.
conversation.
Yeah. But so like just to wrap up, can I ask like what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Oof. Well, I mean, we've been talking a lot about, um, I mean, different scenarios where different groups of people are coming together and talking and creating connections over unlikely divides. I have hope in the basic human need and ability to create relationships. I think it's who we are. I think it's baked into our very need for survival. And I think once we unlock the pathways for those relationships to be formed over whatever divides media, government, society tells us there is, we there there that we will create the relationships we need to survive. I have a hope that we will do that if we're able to get over those hurdles. I think that there's this amazing book called The Body Keeps Score by Peter Van de Kerk. Um, and basically he talks about the book is about trauma and the blocks that trauma can get towards human connection, and this idea of something called mirror neurons, that literally when people are talking, people often match each other's facial expressions, their hand gestures, their tone of voice, and sometimes there's blocks for that, and you tend to match people more that you're attracted to, whether like in a friendship way, romantic way, even just somebody you like talking with. And my question is just how do we get more places for those mirror neurons to fire? And theater is a wonderful way. Start hearing people's stories where you're like, hey, we're from very different areas. You might be from black and raised in Bed-Stuy, and I might be a somebody from suburban Connecticut, and I might hear something from your story that of course, I'm not a Black person raised in the inner city, but some ideas of struggle and the ideas of, the relationships that give us strength. That's a tie. That's an interconnection. And so I think the places where we can see that ties and the more chances we have to fire those mirror neurons, I think we're going to be leaving the world in a better place with more unlikely relationships.
Great. Thank you. And if anybody wants to look into what you're doing, are you online or any social media?
Absolutely, yes. So you can follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram. I'm Tim Steckler on both of those. You can look at my work at timsteckler.com. That's TIMSTECKLER.com. If you want to be involved in the upcoming Irondale production, we're going to probably do ours we're going to start recruiting in the late fall of 2023 and for the performance in 2024. You can look at irondale.org. They'll have all the information there about those issues. And please reach out to me if you're ever saying, hey, there's communities that we want to talk about stories about, or have bridge connections. That's work I love to do, and I'd love to talk with you. So yeah, and you can email me at tsteckler@mac.com, TSTECKLER@mac.com. So please feel free to reach out. And yeah.
All right, great, cool. Thanks so much, Tim. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right, thanks so much, and take care.
Thanks, Michael.